in a town called Orofino, Idaho, in a basement office of a brick house on a hillside above the Clearwater River. There is a fireproof safe that contains 14 years of handwritten field notes about damage to a natural gas pipeline corridor that runs through Clearwater County. The man who filled those notebooks spent his career walking that corridor 4 days a week, in every season, in every weather condition the Idaho mountains can produce. He logged every disturbance he found. Broken survey stakes, mile markers torn from posts at heights no person could reach without a ladder. Cathodic protection test stations smashed flat into the dirt as though something heavier than a black bear had dropped on them from above. Aluminum warning signs ripped through the metal as though paper. For the first 6 years, he attributed it to vandalism. For the next 3, he started suspecting wildlife. For the final 5, he stopped writing the cause down at all, because he had finally accepted what the pattern was telling him, and what it was telling him did not belong in a corporate damage report. We obtained those notebooks. We spoke to the man who filled them. And what he documented across 14 years of methodical observation along a 42-mile stretch of pipeline corridor in north-central Idaho is one of the longest sustained records of dogman activity at a single location that has ever been collected in this country. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We agreed not to use his real name. The pipeline he inspected is still in service. The company that operates it still employs people he trained, still consults the inspection records he wrote, and still maintains insurance policies and regulatory filings that would be affected if his observations became part of any public record. We will call him Roy. The name change is his condition for talking, and once you understand what he carried alone for over a decade, you will understand why he asked. Roy worked as a right-of-way inspector for the company that operates the pipeline. He started in his early 30s after a decade doing surveying work for a timber outfit out of Lewiston, and retired in his late 50s for reasons we will get to. His job was straightforward in description and brutal in practice. The pipeline runs through some of the most remote country in the lower 48, climbing out of the Clearwater River Valley north of Orofino, and crossing the timber-covered ridges of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest before descending toward the Bitterroot Divide on the Montana border. Roy was responsible for walking and driving the corridor from a point near the town of Pierce eastward through the headwaters drainage of the North Fork of the Clearwater. 42 miles end to end. 4 days on, 3 days off. Every month of every year with allowances for snowpack closures in deep winter. A pipeline corridor through forested country looks like a wound in the canopy. The cleared right-of-way runs anywhere from 50 to 100 feet wide depending on the easement, scraped clean of timber and maintained by periodic herbicide application and mechanical brushing. From the air, it is a green ribbon of low grass and pioneer vegetation cutting through the dark conifer cover for hundreds of miles. From the ground, it is a corridor of unnatural openness in country that should be closed canopy old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar and grand fir. Wildlife uses these corridors heavily. Elk travel them, black bears cross them. Mountain lions hunt along the edges where prey concentrates in the open browse. And as Roy would slowly come to understand, other things use them too. Animals that prefer to move at night, that benefit from a 100-foot-wide travel route through otherwise impenetrable forest, and that have apparently decided the corridor belongs to them as much as it belongs to the company that built it. If you want to know what kind of country we are talking about, pull up a map of Idaho and look at the Clearwater Mountains north of Highway 12. That stretch from Pierce East through the upper drainage of the North Fork is some of the emptiest ground in the continental United States. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests cover 4 million acres. The adjacent Selway Bitterroot Wilderness covers another 1.3 million. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, just south of there, is the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48 at 2.5 million acres. You can stand on a ridge in that country and see nothing in any direction but timber and mountain and sky. No roads, no power lines, no human structures. The pipeline corridor is, in many sections, the only break in the canopy for miles. It is also the only reliable indication that anyone has ever been there at all. Roy grew up in Lewiston, the son of a timber faller and a woman who worked at the school district office for 30 years. He spent every summer of his childhood in the mountains north and east of town. He hunted elk every fall from the time he was 12. He knew the difference between a black bear track and a mountain lion track before he could drive. He could read animal sign in dirt, in mud, in snow, and in disturbed vegetation, and by the time the pipeline company hired him in the mid-1990s, he had been studying the patterns of Idaho wildlife for over 20 years. He was not a man who imagined things in the woods. The pipeline company gave him a four-wheel drive truck, a satellite phone, a digital camera, and a set of inspection protocols laid out in a binder thicker than a phone book. He was to drive the corridor where access roads allowed and walk it where they did not. He was to document any encroachment, any vegetation overgrowth, any erosion, any visible disturbance to the buried pipe, and any damage to surface infrastructure, including valve sites, cathodic protection stations, mile markers, warning signs, gate locks, and fence segments. Every inspection had to be logged in writing with date, location coordinates, weather conditions, and photographic documentation. The reports went to a regional office in Spokane. Roy was one of two inspectors covering his stretch of pipeline. The other inspector handled the western section closer to the Snake River. They overlapped only at a transfer point near Pierce and saw each other in person maybe 4 times a year. Roy filed his first incident report 2 weeks into the job. A cathodic protection test station near mile marker 27 had been knocked off its concrete pad. The station consisted of a steel post about 4 feet tall with a wiring junction box on top, used to measure the electrical current applied to the buried pipe to prevent corrosion. The post had been ripped sideways out of the concrete by enough force to crack the pad. The wiring inside the junction box was undisturbed. Whatever had hit it had not been interested in the wires. It had simply pushed or pulled the entire assembly hard enough to break it from the foundation. Roy photographed the damage, noted the GPS coordinates, and filed the report under the company's standard wildlife damage category. His supervisor in Spokane accepted the report without comment. A maintenance crew came out the following week and reset the station in fresh concrete. Roy moved on. 3 weeks later, the same station had been knocked over again. This time, Roy looked more carefully. The concrete pad showed scratches across the surface that he had not noticed on his first visit. He crouched beside the station and ran his fingers across the marks. They were parallel gouges, 4 of them, spaced about 2.5 inches apart. The marks went through the surface concrete and into the aggregate underneath. Whatever made them had been applying enormous force. He photographed the marks with a tape measure laid alongside for scale. He filed his second report, again under wildlife damage, and again the maintenance crew came out and reset the station. This time they used a heavier concrete pad and longer anchor bolts. The station was knocked over a 3rd time within a month. Roy did not understand what he was looking at. Black bears are common in the Clearwater country. He had been around them his whole life. He knew their tracks, their scat, their feeding sign, their claw marks on trees. The marks on that concrete pad did not look like bear claw marks. The spacing was wrong. Bear claws on a foreleg are about 1.25 inches apart at the print, sometimes less, never more than 1.5 inches on a very large male. These marks were 2.5 inches apart. The marks also went too deep. Bears scratch concrete sometimes when they investigate things, but they do not gouge through the surface into the aggregate. Whatever had marked that pad was bigger and stronger than any black bear Roy had ever seen, and there were no grizzly bears in the Clearwater drainage. The last documented grizzly south of Interstate 90 had been killed in the 1940s. He logged the 3rd incident under wildlife damage anyway. There was no other available category. The form had checkboxes for vandalism, wildlife damage, weather, equipment failure, and other, with a free text field at the bottom for explanation. Roy was not going to write a description in the free text field that he could not explain himself. He put it under wildlife damage and let his supervisor classify it however the system needed it classified. That choice established the pattern that would govern the next 14 years of his professional life. Document what you see. Categorize it under the nearest available label. Let the system process the report the way the system processes things. Do not write down anything that could not be explained because the company did not employ inspectors to identify things that could not be explained. The company employed inspectors to file reports. The second cathodic protection station on the corridor was knocked over 6 weeks after the first one stopped being knocked over. Then a third. Then a mile marker post was torn out of the ground. Then a section of barbed wire fencing at a valve site access road was pulled flat for 40 feet. The steel T-posts bent at angles that suggested something had simply walked through the fence. By the end of his first year on the job, Roy had filed 11 separate incident reports, all categorized as wildlife damage, all involving infrastructure that no animal in the Idaho field guide should be capable of damaging. He did not realize what was happening yet. He was 33 years old, new to the job, learning the corridor mile by mile, and he had no framework for what he was finding. He thought it was a particularly large bear, or possibly two of them, working the corridor as a travel route and treating the company infrastructure as an irritant. He started carrying a sidearm on his inspections after the 8th incident. The company had no objection. Pipeline inspectors in remote country routinely carried firearms because of the wildlife risk. Black bears in the spring after waking from hibernation could be unpredictable. Mountain lions were rare but present. The sidearm was a Smith & Wesson revolver chambered in .44 Magnum, the same caliber his father had carried while falling timber. He had grown up around it. He had qualified with it at the firing range outside of Lewiston. He felt comfortable with it on his belt. He never fired it. Not once in 14 years. He would draw it 3 times. Twice in the first 6 years and once in the final year, in circumstances we will come back to, but he never fired. Whatever was damaging the corridor never gave him a target. It worked at night. It worked when he was off duty. It worked when he was 40 miles away at his home in Orofino. And by the time he arrived to find the damage the next morning, it was gone. The years passed and the damage continued. In his second year, he started keeping a personal log in addition to the company reports. The personal log was a green, canvas-bound field notebook that he kept in the basement office of his house. The notebook recorded the same incidents the company reports recorded, but with one critical difference. The notebook also recorded his own observations and assessments without the constraint of the company's classification system. He wrote down what he actually thought he was looking at in his own language, without trying to fit it into a checkbox. The notebook became his way of staying sane. He could file the corporate report and then come home and write the truth in the notebook. And the act of writing the truth somewhere allowed him to keep filing the corporate reports. By his 5th year, the notebook was nearly full and he had started a second one. By his 10th year, he had 4 of them stacked in his fireproof safe. What the notebooks documented, in his own words, was a pattern. The damage was not random. It clustered along specific sections of the corridor. The same 8 or 10 infrastructure points were targeted repeatedly, sometimes year after year, while other infrastructure within the same corridor sat completely untouched. The targeted sections shared characteristics. They were on the higher elevation portions of the corridor between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. They were in proximity to streams or springs. They were near the boundary of the corridor and the surrounding old-growth timber where the canopy closed in. And they were all within a specific geographic zone, a stretch of about 18 miles in the heart of the corridor where the pipeline crossed the headwaters of 3 tributary creeks of the North Fork Clearwater. If you have spent time in the country north of Pierce, anywhere up toward Bertha Hill or the Cold Springs Peak area. You know the kind of timber I am describing. Old-growth Douglas fir 3 feet across at the base, western red cedar choking the creek bottoms. A canopy so dense the forest floor stays in twilight even on a clear July afternoon. That stretch of the Clearwater drainage has had Nez Perce traditional ties going back thousands of years. And according to people who have spent more time studying that landscape than I have, it has been quietly producing strange reports for as long as anyone has been writing them down. Let me know in the comments if you have hunted or worked or hiked anywhere in that drainage and noticed anything you could not explain, because the reports I have been pulling from that area lately are more numerous than most people realize. Roy realized in his 6th year on the job that the damage was being caused by an animal he could not identify, and that the animal was operating in a coordinated pattern across a defined territory. This was not a vandal. No vandal hikes 8 miles up a logging road in the middle of the night to rip a cathodic protection station off its pad and then hikes back out without leaving a single shoe print or tire mark. No vandal targets the same 8 infrastructure points repeatedly over 6 years. No vandal applies the kind of force required to bend 3/4-inch steel anchor bolts. He stopped filing damage reports under the vandalism category that year. He moved them all to wildlife damage. The company never questioned it. The maintenance budget for the corridor was sufficient to absorb the repair costs. The damage was concentrated enough that the company occasionally asked whether he could identify what was causing it. But the questions were budget questions. Could the pattern be predicted and prevented? Roy would say he had been unable to determine the source. The supervisor would nod and approve the next round of repairs, and the conversation would end. In the 7th year, Roy found the tracks. He had been finding tracks all along, of course. The corridor in spring and fall was a record of every animal that crossed it. Elk in herds, deer in pairs and singletons, black bears in their characteristic loose-toed walk, coyotes, the occasional cougar, bobcat. He logged the species in his daily reports the way he had been trained to. What he found in his 7th year was different. It was late October. The corridor at the higher elevations had a thin crust of overnight snow, maybe an inch, the kind that takes a track perfectly and holds it through the first hours of morning before melting back into the duff. Roy was walking the corridor near mile 29, in one of the targeted sections, when he came around a curve and saw a line of tracks crossing the right-of-way. The tracks came out of the timber on the south side and disappeared into the timber on the north side, a distance of about 60 feet across the cleared corridor. They were spaced about 50 inches apart. They were canine in shape, with 4 toes and visible claw marks at the front, but they were enormous. Each individual track was almost 6 inches long. Roy stopped where he stood. He set his pack down. He pulled out his measuring tape and his camera. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles with the tape laid alongside for scale. Then he measured the stride and recorded it in his notebook. 52 inches between front prints. The straddle was 12 inches. He had been measuring wolf tracks in Idaho for over a decade by that point. Wolves had been reintroduced to central Idaho in the mid-1990s, and had established a healthy breeding population in the Clearwater country. A large male gray wolf in Idaho produces a track about 4.5 inches long, with a stride of about 30 inches at a walk and a straddle of 4 or 5 inches. What he was looking at on the snow that October morning was almost double the wolf measurements on every dimension, and it was bipedal. The track pattern was wrong for any 4-legged animal. The prints were arranged in a single alternating line, left, right, the same arrangement a person walking would leave. There were no rear foot impressions registering near the front foot impressions, which is what you see with a quadrupedal canid. The animal that crossed the corridor that morning was walking on 2 legs. Roy crouched in the snow beside one of those tracks for a long time. He told us later he sat there for almost 45 minutes. He was not confused. He had finally understood what he had been documenting for 7 years. The cathodic protection stations torn off their pads, the mile markers ripped out of the ground at 7 feet, the fence wire bent flat, the signs torn through the metal. None of it had been a bear. None of it had been a particularly aggressive cougar. None of it had been vandalism. He had been walking through the territory of an animal that walked on 2 legs and was strong enough to twist 3/4-inch steel anchor bolts with its hands. And he had been doing it 4 days a week for 7 years without knowing it. He followed the tracks. They went into the timber on the north side of the corridor, and he followed them for about 300 yards before the snow thinned and the ground hardened and the trail faded into the duff. They climbed a low ridge and then descended into a creek drainage. He turned back at the creek because the day was getting on and he was alone, and his sidearm was a .44 Magnum revolver with 6 rounds, and he had no illusions about what 6 rounds would accomplish against whatever had left those prints. He hiked back to his truck. He drove home that night to Orofino. He sat in his basement office and he opened his notebook and he wrote the first entry that named what he was looking at. He used the word dogman. He underlined it. He had heard the word dogman before. He was not unfamiliar with the lore. His older brother had been into all of that for years and had played him Steve Cook's song from 1987 at a family gathering sometime in the late 1990s. The recording Cook had intended as a radio prank and then watched become a magnet for serious witness reports out of Michigan. Roy had filed it under interesting but unrelated to his actual life. He worked a pipeline in Idaho. The dogman, to the extent it was anything at all, was a Michigan phenomenon. Idaho had Sasquatch reports, plenty of them, but Sasquatch and dogman were different categories of strange. He had always assumed that if he was going to encounter anything unusual in his own woods, it would be the former rather than the latter. The tracks on the snow that morning did not match what he understood about Sasquatch. The proportions were wrong. The toe configuration was wrong. The stride pattern was wrong. What he was looking at had a canid foot and walked on 2 legs, and the only category of being in any folklore he had ever heard describe that combination was the one he had filed away as a Michigan story years before. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell his supervisor, his wife, or the other inspector on the western half of the corridor. He went back to work the next morning and he filed his report and he categorized the track sighting under wildlife observation. Large canid, unspecified species. He attached the photographs. The supervisor in Spokane accepted the report and filed it. Nobody asked any questions. This is the moment in Roy's story where the easy explanations close down and the hard one becomes the only one that fits. For 7 years, he had been documenting damage that did not match any known animal. He had been classifying it under the available categories because the system required a category. Now he had a track record showing the cause was a bipedal canid with a 52-inch stride, and he had no framework anywhere in his professional training for what that meant. The company did not have a category for it. The State Department of Fish and Game did not have a category for it. And if Roy went to any of them and said he had found the tracks of a bipedal canid that was approximately twice the size of a gray wolf and was damaging pipeline infrastructure on a defined territorial pattern, he would not be taken seriously. His employment would be quietly reviewed, and within 6 months he would be out of a job and out